If you casually ask a friend, can I use talcum powder on my genitals? They'll give you an answer.
Hi, I'm Andy.
And I'm Roger.
And welcome to The Middle,
where we try to have thoughtful conversations
about awkward topics
on our search to find the middle.
That's fatphobic.
I don't feel war. I just own halfway to Siwa.
A few moments ago, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
I act as if God exists.
Put your masks on.
How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words.
Roger, Nick, how you going?
Hello.
Hey Andy, how you doing?
So today we're very excited to have a guest on. Nick is an economist within the Australian government. He's also spent time in academia looking at tax and transfer policy design and implementation. He loves to look at policy problems, particularly those at the intersection of technology, regulation, behavioural science and economics. We've asked Nick today to join us on the podcast to discuss AI, including the impact of large language models such as ChatGPT. Thank you for joining us, Nick, and welcome to The Middle.
Pleasure to be on the show.
So, Nick, just before we get into it, did you want to briefly introduce yourself, your background, and why we're here today to talk about AI?
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Roger. Once again, thanks for inviting me on the pod. My background, I'm a trained economist. I've spent a big chunk of my life working with data, but I've also dabbled into behavioral economics, behavioral science, psychology. I think ChatGPT fundamentally is a transformative technology where these multiple domains intersect that in a way could alter the landscape for various domains. And it's that intersection that's quite fascinating.
Thanks for that, Nick, and I'm sure we'll discuss some of that today.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on, Nick. Andy and I usually start off the show with a little bit of banter and a little bit talking about our week. And I thought I'd tell maybe a little bit of a story to loosen us up. And like all of my good stories, they involve me in compromising positions. In my old building at work, I had a gym. And actually, it's a strange thing because normally in everyday life, you see your colleagues dressed in work attire. But for a small portion of your day, you see them naked. And so it becomes kind of a weird thing, right? So we had this kind of play out and there was a small locker room at the bottom of the building. And for a long time, I noticed in the men's locker room, I started seeing these kind of rings of powder, these rings of white powder on the tiles where everyone was getting changed outside their lockers. And it started to happen over and over again, just seeing, these couple of rings. And I just thought to myself, like, what in the world is this white powder doing on the floor? And so I looked down to kind of see what it was. And at the exact time as I bent down, I got the most heinous foot cramp. And I lurched down in pain and my towel fell off. And it was really embarrassing, obviously. And then at the exact same moment, I found out the horror of what was actually making the talcum powder ring. One of our older colleagues came over, dropped his towel, and then he reached into his locker and he pulled out the biggest can of talcum powder I've ever seen and threw it up against his genitals and then put his underwear on. But I was just like, oh, that's why every time this guy does it, he makes a ring when he's talcum powdering his junk. And it got me thinking, am I missing a beat here? And is that actually the way to go? Has anyone had any experience with this phenomenon of dry powdering your junk?
This is a very interesting story. I haven't heard that one before. But I think, I'm one of those idiots who tend to take things a little bit too seriously. So even if I'm kind of confronted with a funny story, I try to find a deeper meaning behind it for some reason, which just spoils the fun. And everyone around me absolutely hates me for that. And my first thought was, were you still in pain when you had that revelation? Or did your brain suddenly, completely forgot the pain because you had this amazing view in front of you, if you want to call it that? Or was it the truth was somewhere in the middle where you were still in pain, but, you also kind of were glad that you finally got the answer to that problem?
In pain, definitely. Bringing it back to the episode, I just upgraded my subscription to ChatGPT and I asked, is talcum powdering your genitals a good practice? And ChatGPT told me no, talcum powder is not recommended for the use on the genitals. There is some evidence to suggest that talcum powder use in the genital area may increase the risk of ovarian cancer in women and testicular cancer in men. Talcum powder can also cause irritation, dryness, and other skin problems. If you are experiencing discomfort or irritation in the genital areas, it is best to consult a healthcare professional for the advice and best course of treatment. There you go. See, it's taken all the fun out of it now. We know too much now.
Exactly. And like it's the touch at the end which is just so cringeworthy. It's kind of like those disclaimers that you see and hear on TV all the time, in a robotic voice sometimes.
Sorry to interrupt the episode. If you're enjoying our content, make sure to hit subscribe on your preferred podcast app so you never miss an episode.
Let your friends know about us. Your support means a lot, and word of mouth really helps.
A great way to share with your friends is to comment, engage, like and share some of our social media posts. We're on all major platforms, and you can find our links in our show notes or our website, www.themiddle.site.
And guess what? We've got even more for you. We're building a subscriber email list so we can give access to content that you can't get any other way. Check our show notes to find out how to get added to our subscriber list, or visit our website at www.themiddle.site.
Thank you. And we'll return you now to the episode. I kind of, in this scenario, put myself in the mind of this old man. He's been talcum powdering his balls regularly after workout, probably for his whole life, right? How would you use ChatGPT to convince him otherwise? Like, how do you actually change someone's mind?
Isn't like half the problem, though, or in fact, 99% of the problem, precisely that it's a computer?
But, in a lot of instances, people trust machines more than humans. And one of the easiest example that you can think of, which you'll probably experience yourself, or at least I have multiple times, is when Google Maps tries to give me directions. And I know for a fact, for some reason, that if I take that shortcut, I'll get there faster. But I tend to override my own instinct and assume that the machine might know better. It's picked up the traffic signals or something. So let me just follow that, all right? And this is one of the things where people kind of concede to the machines just because they think that they're probably a little bit smarter than them.
A place I used to live at, there was this young lady driving a car, and she ended up driving into a ditch just outside the house. And when I say a ditch, I mean a reasonable sized ditch. And it turns out the reason she drove into the ditch was that her GPS had the road going straight. But what made it this story even worse is that she calls some doofus to come and help her. He gets in and he tries to reverse it up the hill, but he just floors the accelerator to try and get some traction to reverse it out. Keeps flooring it. Nothing's happening, right? So all he's doing is creating all this friction, all this heat. And so then the car catches on fire.
It'd be even better, Andy, if then, her Google Maps said, please divert this route. There's been an accident. But, Nick, it's a really good point about conceding to, digital authority. I remember driving with my dad or wherever, he would never trust the GPS. He would just never do it. It was always wrong. He'd always know better. And it's only, I guess, as things have come to prominence around Google Maps and other things like that, then now people have that trust that it is very accurate. And I wonder somehow if it's a generational thing too, that younger people are more inclined to respect the authority of these big tech companies. And then what that then does to your mindset of not questioning things, right? So what if I typed into ChatGPT for, is talcum powdering your genitals a good practice? Said, yes, absolutely. You should do it twice a day. Now I'm in a predicament because I don't want to do that, but maybe I do concede. Maybe I think actually it's going to help me and I start doing it. And I think that that's a interesting part around what responsibility does a user have when they start to leverage these tools, and what can you rely on?
Yeah, look, that's a very good question. And I guess just going back to your example about how
Maybe we can get off the talcum powder on the balls example and move to more.
I was using the Google.
You meant the GPS. Okay.
Yeah, I was using the GPS example. So your technology is kind of complementing or aiding your decisions. So in behavioral science, we say that you moved away from a systems two thinking, which is where you have to stop and think about something a bit more deeply, to a system one thinking where you've kind of gone on autopilot. So the trust bit is there, but it's not necessarily that now. It's more the fact that you've now internalized the idea over time with the repeated interactions with the technology that I'll have to trust this. It's mostly right, even though it's not 100% right. It's mostly right. So I've got to trust it as opposed to my gut instincts or taking the time to actually think through the fact that I'm going on a totally different road and I know that's a wrong path where the GPS is taking me, but I'm still going to follow through because I'm just like my autopilot, my system 1 is overriding my systems 2 thinking.
Just reflecting on being in Ubers, right? Uber vehicles. And one of the aspects of it, which is interesting as a user, is that you get into the car and you've got your destination because you've put it in the app before you even get in the car. And the driver starts driving this really bizarro way that you would never go. Like, your local neighborhood, no, why would you possibly go that street? That's the most stupid thing. But, the app is giving the Uber driver, the instructions on where to drive, and the Uber driver's not even thinking. They're just mindlessly driving and, where their phone tells them to.
Yeah.
And if you tell the driver, hey, don't go that way is like ridiculously stupid, like go this other way, they're kind of, I don't know. But I think to your point, Nick, it's kind of like the Uber driver they've turned off their brain and they're just completely now reliant on what the app's telling them to do. Yeah. And, so today we're talking about AI, and a lot of us have been caught up in the novelty of ChatGPT. I think it's probably a good time to maybe put on the table some foundation concepts in terms of how do these models even work? Like, where do they get the information from? How do they know to tell you whether to put talcum powder on your balls or not?
I think you promised that you're not going to use that example.
Before we go, what it just reminds me sometimes?
You've just broken the trust now.
It reminds me of that movie, Anchorman, where Ron Burgundy always reads what's on the teleprompter, no matter what it says, right? Like, he just reads it. And I just worry sometimes, like, as a human species, are we just going to be reading the teleprompter without even doing it? Everyone simultaneously talcum powdering their balls for no reason. But anyway, let's get back to the script. I got us into this mess. Let's get out.
Sure. All right. Where to start? I think there's a bit to unpack, especially for those who are listening and who've probably got no background. They've just picked up a tool that they started interacting with and they're amazed by its capabilities, or sometimes, totally weirded out. How does it work? Yes. So what underpins ChatGPT is a deep learning algorithm. But at its most fundamental level, an artificial intelligence is just a massive prediction engine. And people have different definitions, but this is how I make sense of it. And its underlying foundation of that massive prediction engine is just simple statistics. It's the same old statistical model, and believe it or not, the simple regression technique is sometimes one of the most effective machine learning model. So people get confused between what's a machine learning model, what's AI, and what's deep learning. So AI is basically if you think about like a Venn diagram, AI is the superset. It encompasses all of the computation techniques that have come out in the last 20 odd years or so. Machine learning is a subset of AI. So it's just one type of AI. Deep learning is then a subset of machine learning. It's like the next level of machine learning. But just going back to what machine learning is, because that's where you start. The simple regression technique that a lot of us have probably studied in Stats 101 in school or uni. The simple regression model is actually one of the most effective machine learning models. And people are often surprised by that.
So just Nick, for anyone who's, regression analysis, I mean, this is essentially, in layman's term, is looking at the relationships between two or more sets of data, I guess.
Yeah, that's correct. So, like a simple regression, you're basically looking at, as an example, you're trying to figure out the impact of an increase in supply on house prices. So, an increase in the stock, you take the stock as one variable and you're trying to see how that's actually going to change house prices. And then, as you said, you're trying to find a correlation between the two. Essentially, what we're doing is you're basically trying to make some inference about how good the variable that you've picked up, the stock of housing, is in predicting the house price. But essentially, at the most basic level, you're trying to identify a relation between the two variables.
So in terms of large language models like ChatGPT, I mean, this is going to be a gross oversimplification, but it's almost like, okay, the inputs are talcum powder, balls, good, idea. And the system is trying to ascertain what the answer should be. And I guess there's two components to it. One is how should I formulate the sentence, mimicking human language, applying what kind of words do, people commonly use, but it's not just the language side of it. It's also, well, what's the actual right answer? So let's say, on average, you have a divergence of views on that particular question. It's basically looking at all of the different data sets that's been inputted into the model, and it's trying to work out a combination of when that question gets asked, probabilistically speaking, using these, broadly a statistical approach, which answer is, first of all, most likely correct based on all of the inputs, but then not only that, but what would be the right framing of words to respond to that question. So, I mean, that's a gross oversimplification, but it's basically harvesting the data from whether it's the whole of the internet or whatever the input sources are to prop up the answer. Are there any great sort of mistakes in that analysis?
Yeah, look, really the machines are not that smart. It's not really learning grammar. It's just learning the statistical connections between two words to process what was asked of it. And then it turns that attention network onto itself to create a response and uses the same probabilities to calculate the most likely word to respond. So the first word is the, for example. It then uses the association or the mapping it had created from your original prompt to then use that to predict the next word after the. And it's got 3 different modes: creator, precise, and I think an intermediate mode, something like that, right?
Yes.
So the creator mode is different because in the creator mode, it actually applies some randomization. So it's not going to follow the logic rule completely. It just sometimes randomly picks up something different. And that's why it can hallucinate as well, right? In a creator mode. I don't know if you've heard of DALL-E 2 or Midjourney or Stable Diffusion that are making these unrealistic, images. It's like the Pope in a puffer jacket, which is pretty hard to believe. I was, or
damn,
Donald
I think
Trump.
I bought that original painting. They fooled me.
Non-fungible token, right, Roger?
Yeah, so Stable Diffusion, Midjourney, DALL-E 2, they're also deep learning models. In fact, they're better than a ChatGPT model, if I can say that, because they've been around for a lot longer. They came out a lot earlier.
So, Nick, it really is about that, putting 1,000 monkeys in a room, pumping out everything. They just have a really good quality control editor sitting over the top to bring it to life.
That's pretty much it. Yes. Yeah. And the important thing is that, as I mentioned, the output is not entirely predictable because it can apply some randomization. And this is where it's interesting because whatever association it has picked up sometimes is impossible to tell. Like, you can't explain it. It can get emergent properties. So emergent properties are like, there's a classic example where I think the head of Google was mentioned that they never trained Lambda, their large language model, to, they didn't have Bengali in their training data set. But Lambda was able to respond and talk in Bengali without even having that information in this data set. How it drew out those associations, where it got the information from, because obviously it uses the whole of the data available on the internet. It's scraped it, but it was never trained on learning Bengali, but it picked it up. So there's some emergent properties that you don't actually know. Most of it is predictable because you've trained it on this bit of information. You've taken out the bias. You've given it a high quality data set. But then there are these emergent properties that come from when you turn it into a creative mode, we introduce some randomization. Yeah. And it just makes these miraculous kind of understanding, which is completely out of the blue.
Nick, it's quite interesting you say that because when I was playing around with ChatGPT just today, I asked it to actually make me something a little bit creative for a piece of prose. And as it was typing it out on the prompt, I was like, oh, this is gold dust. But then something happened where the prompt failed and the server connection failed. And I was like, no, because no two responses are exactly the same. And once you lose it, it's gone. And it got me really thinking that it is like speaking to someone from across the hall. It's a moment in time, it's fleeting, and it may never be recreated in exactly the same manner ever again. And so if you lose that prompt and it doesn't fully respond to you and you have a server error, it's gone. And yes, you can ask it the same question, but it won't be the same response. And that was the annoying thing for me.
If you've got a creator mode on, then yes, the randomization could change the response. But the thing is, the emergent properties that I was mentioning, as you said, if you give it the same question, it would not give you the same response. In a similar fashion, if you give it a slightly different prompt, it could act as a trigger to create a new emergent property. You could design a prompt, Roger, that could make ChatGPT do something that it wasn't trained on.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it made up that talcum powder thing on the spot because it didn't know how to respond, to be honest,
Well, who's the ultimate creator, you or ChatGPT? I would say probably you, right?
Well, as we know, Andy, about this podcast, it's about asking the right questions, right?
Some of this stuff underscores your earlier point around, we kind of understand sort of how they work, but we don't kind of understand how they work. So we set the broad parameters and we kind of know the framework of how it's doing its thing, but we once we let it loose, we don't really understand, how it comes to its answers. But one comment I was just going to make around, it's this fleeting thought in the hall, and you lose the sort of the magic. Now, obviously, there's a different process to get to the outcome as what humans use. But like essentially, when you think about like how we learn to firstly read, and then as we get a bit older, we can start to write, and we might refine our craft. And I mean, aren't humans kind of doing the same thing, maybe in a different way, but aren't we kind of doing the same thing in terms of replicating things we read and writing and emulating that in a similar way? I mean, the processing that goes on within our brain is different. But yeah, I mean, like, that's why, when you read things written by humans, sometimes, they can fall into, repetitive tropes, in the same way as we speak. I'm sure we'll use lots of filler words like, and likes and and ahs and all of that sort of stuff. Isn't the AI doing the same thing, really?
It's such a strange thing, that is just another primate, right? Like in that primate example, if you get a chimpanzee that comes from a particular group and has a really amazing way of, say, opening a coconut using this tool, the chimpanzee that has this knowledge of how to do it better and more efficiently will revert to the group's way of doing it, because it's more important to that chimpanzee to fit in the group, be accepted by the group, than prove that they have a better way of doing things. And I feel like sometimes AI can be caught up in the same thing. They're learning from us, right? It is more important for an AI to fit in and be accepted by humans by maybe speaking to them in their language or being more relatable than to be perfectly right all the time, because they also depend on us for their existence. And so that's like a interesting piece on this, that actually, if you want to make an AI and a language more digestible, it has to be more human. And what comes with being more human is potentially not always right.
Well, isn't that creative mode? Isn't it like that it, rather than use, the most common word that would be used in that setting, that it'll use the 150th most common word used in that, just to be a little bit different, right?
Yeah, exactly. The way they pick up the next word after the next word after the next word is based on probability. So, normally they'll pick up one word that's supposed to be the most likely to come after the previous word. But in a creator mode, it might not. It might pick something with a low probability. But the example that you were giving me, Roger, that group thinking or the herd mentality it is part of our DNA, in the sense that we've always kind of, as Homo sapiens, we're vulnerable, right? So we always relied on the strength of the group to survive. But on the same token, we always had that one black sheep or the loose cannon, who'd kind of go out of his or her way to do something different and then come up with a more innovative way of actually helping the whole group survive, right? And that's how a lot of the evolutionary knowledge came from. So just going back to the example, it could be the same Homo sapien who was in another context quite compliant and stuck with the herd behavior. But in a different context, it could have potentially put on his or her creator mode on and did something different, right? So, but ultimately it's the same primate, same monkey, or we want to call it that. So I think ChatGPT, in a way, we're forcing it to choose a creator or a precise mode, but essentially it's doing the same thing. In a precise mode, it could be politically correct, right? But in a creator mode, and if you give it reasonable prompts, it could turn completely racist, right? But ultimately it's looking at some sort of unpredictable way, and humans are, similarly unpredictable.
That was a great kind of basis for the mechanisms behind ChatGPT. The thing that I find most disappointing is that it always comes back to bloody Stats 101, the most boring subject, but everything is underpinned by it. I don't know why stats teachers are always so dry, but I did have a good one when I was going through my learning. And when we first came into the room, they had the X and Y axis. And on one, it was the number of churches. And on the other, it was the number of strip clubs. And they were positively correlated. So where you find more churches, you find more strip clubs. And it was just obviously enforcing this idea of correlation does not mean causation. But, if you do want to look for strip clubs, look for churches. you probably will be onto a good thing.
I'm not so sure about that particular example. I think there might be something in that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a classic spurious correlation, right? Yeah.
Well, not surrounding the Vatican, it isn't.
You don't know, Andy. they're in the canals. Okay, let's move on. What is ChatGPT going to mean for applications in the future? Are we doomed to all have to bow down towards this new technology? Will it displace a whole part of the workforce? What does it actually mean for jobs in the future?
The economic impacts of ChatGPT, there hasn't been a lot of work done yet. I'm sure people are, racing to churn out academic papers on how this is going to have an impact on the broader economy. And I mean, ultimately, we're going to say we don't know the answer, right? But in 2022, this fascinating paper by an MIT economist, David Autor, he wrote a paper where the authors found that 60% of workers that are today employed in occupations, those occupations did not exist in 1940, which kind of implied that around 85% of employment growth over the last 80 odd years or so is actually driven by the technology creating new positions. So yes, there's a possibility that this technology is quite disruptive, and a lot of people have actually said that this could be the next general purpose technology in the likes of steam engine or automobile or electricity for that matter. So it could be one of those general purpose technology that has an application into every field or every occupation that you can imagine that currently exists, and could potentially create new ones as well. So if it's that kind of significant, let's just suppose it is for a second, then what are the implications? So there could be a fundamental restructure. And I guess you got to think about it, obviously, from both short, medium, and long-term perspective. Goldman Sachs put out a paper, I think last month. I wouldn't call it a rough, preliminary kind of analysis of how it's going to impact the job market. They talked about 2/3 of the occupations are exposed to some degree, and ChatGPT or a similar bot can do between a quarter and half of their workload. So not completely, but it can do almost half of their workload. So basically, like you're kind of saying, someone's going to lose 50% or more of their daily workload to a bot. And what does that mean? They might not have a job in a lot of cases. But Goldman Sachs kind of says in their paper, a lot of that is desk-bound jobs. So they do not include in their analysis robotics. So robots actually substituting for people.
The thing that's different about AI, or certainly as ChatGPT has kind of underscored, is that maybe pre-ChatGPT, the conversation around automation and things like that, there was this sort of view that, well, if you have a routine job, routine jobs are the kinds of jobs which can be automated and are at threat from technology and new technology that can displace those jobs. But I think what's different about AI, particularly ChatGPT, it's actually now the non-routine jobs, the ones that involve, people having to come up with answers to things which can't be programmed, aren't really confined to an if-then answer. So, and this is really what's unique about it. And thinking of maybe service jobs, I mean, services, it's the biggest employer, right, usually in advanced economies. So with so many service jobs which require that sort of interpersonal connection, like these are now on the table for technological displacement. But I guess, and I'm not sure if this is something touched on in the papers that you're referring to, but whenever jobs get displaced by technology, what happens is, sure, there might be a short-run effect. That job ceases to exist, but it frees up essentially skilled labor to go to somewhere else in the economy where they actually can add value. Now, it might be for some individual worker, it might be that they are worse off. Maybe the thing that they like, thinking about sign writers, for example, pre-computers, right? If they had no other sort of ability to retrain and reskill, they're made worse off by, computers that can design better graphics than what they can.
Andy, there's still a thriving sign market in hospitals in Australia. Thank you very much.
Hipster areas as well, I think. But yeah, I mean, like that individual might be worse off, but the fact that we don't train new sign writers, but we instead train, like younger people coming into the workforce, that we're not training them to do these obsolete professions. We're training them to do different things, and maybe the young person that would have gone into the job that has now been displaced by ChatGPT or its future variants, they will just do the thing that where so this is how it kind of works, and that's probably why we don't need to be quite so fearful.
Yeah, and look, there is a reason for optimism. I agree that short to medium term pain can bring around lasting changes. So, how do we actually manage that transition? The short to medium term will determine how good those new innovations built on top of ChatGPT or, its variants would either transform and benefit society or, create a dystopian future.
So Nick and Andy, I'd like to kind of interject here and lay out a little bit of searching for the middle musings here. At my work, we've been using chatbots for quite a while now. And I remember when we first embarked on this many years ago, way before ChatGPT, there was a white paper that came out provocatively labeled digital slavery, because essentially it's owning almost an employee that works around the clock that you own and that you then gain all the benefits from. One thing that always comes up was, should these autonomous resources and robots in the future be taxed? So what I'm interested in is, and to offset some of these social change and displacements that we're talking about, where is the middle on this subject of one end being they're definitely going to be taxed and they're going to be used to offset and slow down innovation and all these other things versus a more free market that we've been discussing?
So I think, I remember reading that article as well. I think back in the 2017, 2018, when they started talking about, taxing robots.
By the way, we already do tax robots through...
That's correct. I was just gonna say that. So yeah, you're right. It's a form of capital. How it's defined has thrown a few curveballs in coming up with a good way of taxing them. But I think the problem there is a lot of these technologies are intangible, and intangible assets are notoriously difficult to tax unless you have a global agreement on how you would tax them. Something like the OECD, which is a group of wealthy countries, they've come up with, something called a base erosion and profit shifting regime, where they've identified, some of the tax loopholes using intangibles and others as well, clever accounting shenanigans, and found a way for countries to come to, some sort of agreement around things like a minimum tax threshold that everyone has to charge, like a base level of tax, so you stop the race to the bottom, but also what and how you can tax it. So I don't think in the current framework, the taxation regime is currently designed. It may or may not be able to keep up to some of the changes that are coming through in this domain.
Not to get too theoretical here, but like our current tax system in most countries, but certainly in Australia, is basically the principle is if you earn a labour income, if your income's derived from work, you're actually doing your 35, 40 hours a week, whatever your job is, that income gets treated a certain way where it gets taxed, according to, progressive tax system. But if your income is wholly derived from capital, let's say 100% of your income is just because you've got investments or wealth, you actually pay more tax because it gets taxed not only in the sense that companies pay company tax, right? But then it gets taxed through the income tax system with the same progressive income tax arrangements. So, and there's probably, a few other features in there around dividend imputation and things like that. But broadly speaking, that's the model, and that's recognition that if you're earning money because you just happen to own assets which earn on your behalf, that it's fairer to charge a high rate of tax. So maybe that is true for AI and all of that. But I guess should we have some extra tax? Should we treat it differently to other forms of capital? I probably think we should, because that's a pretty big disincentive to their application. I mean, they're fundamentally beneficial technologies. Now we can have another conversation about the ethics and, are we going to get, is the world going to get taken over by these technologies? But to the extent that we save ourselves effort and labor, and rather than having to spend money on hiring a person to do what's essentially something that can be done by a machine, that's a good thing for us. We benefit from that.
Yeah. So look, I mean, one point that I did want to bring in, and this goes back to, what I was talking about with the previous general purpose technologies, was that a good or heavy sometimes, but mostly a good regulatory regime, which I wouldn't say controlled, but kind of was able to guide, or in some cases completely ban, in other cases, imposed regulation around basic things like safety, fairness, like if you ask most people, fairness is one of their key demands in any transaction or a process. So that heavy regulation from the 1950s onwards to 1980s was actually a period of great innovation as well. For a lot of reasons, it was considered to be the golden age for innovation. So I don't necessarily agree that if you actually tax it, you're going to curb innovation. And a few people who've either by luck or by association are able to extract all the rents from those technologies, then from their perspective, the rest of the society can go to hell. Doesn't need to exist because the machines can do all the jobs. So is that what we want? Right?
But we'll still need massagists and talcum powder therapists, won't we?
It's about the general conditions for everyone. I mean, one of the things that they say about Amazon, for example, is that Amazon created these really high-level jobs at the top, but then this really low-scale, low-level jobs at the bottom. And essentially, that's what they call the hollowing out of the middle class, right? And that's not, I guess, optimal conditions for a healthy society. So ultimately, what I'm trying to say is innovation tends to thrive more optimally in a society that's regulated. Now, you can decide on the level of regulation, but light touch regulation is not the answer.
But I think, these technologies, they're like emerging technologies. And at a philosophical level, I think it's fair to say, well, we really need to watch this and be alert to this and be responsive. But it's the Petri dish phase of this technology. I mean, it really is, because whilst ChatGPT is impressive, we don't know what the implications are. No one does. And
no, that's true. But on the same token, I'll argue that this is actually, when it's in that Petri dish stage, this is the right time to get ahead and find how you can best regulate it based on the information that you have right now.
But we don't even know what the regulatory objectives are, right? Like if you want to regulate it, presumably you have an objective, right? Or you have evidence of some problem, but that's lacking. Like
but there's certain principles that we can all agree on. So you can, and this is where AI ethics comes into play. I mean, there always going to be some principles that I think, and you can tell me if you don't agree with any of those. But things like privacy, safety, reliability, can we explain what it's doing? Is the decision that the algorithm's making, what are the transparency or the governance features of that? Can we interpret some of those choices it's making? Where is the accountability and fairness? I mean, okay, if you don't necessarily agree with those principles at a broader level, then you probably got a point. But
isn't some of that, in the application of the technology? So it's not so much regulating the technology itself, it's how you apply it. So for example, just to take recruitment, right? You might have an overarching policy framework that says, you should not unfairly discriminate people through a recruitment process, right? Like race, gender, religion, those sorts of things, right? And let's say a company comes up with a novel application of these systems and says, "Oh, I'm going to use this to do my screening," and it turns out that the AI systems are working in a manner that contravenes the anti-discrimination obligations of a company, then that's how you deal with it. You deal with it at that level, because I suppose maybe a concern would be that
if the discrimination is baked in the actual design
but that's
of
the
AI.
problem, right? If you were to regulate that these systems should not be discriminatory, right? The people who design and come up with and innovate it probably wouldn't even know how to do that, because there'd be ways that they're discriminatory that they can't even foresee, right? There's no button to press, we'll untick the discriminate button in the settings, that such a button doesn't exist, right? It's in the design of it, and these things happen in kind of unanticipated ways.
Yeah, no, that's true. But I mean, that's exactly what I'm saying. Right now, even though the genie is out of the bottle, right now is the time to actually come up with some of those broader principles that would normally apply. And of course, there would be multiple ways of actually curbing some of the AI's nasty tendencies. But if you don't start now, we're probably in the same phase where the early internet was, back in the 1990s.
Oh, but that's the best time on the internet.
No, that was a lost opportunity. Because some of the broader implications, where it ended up or what happened, we've only just started realizing now.
I think social media is probably a good example of that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm talking about. It's like we knew that they had the potential to bring about massive change, but we did not consider how we're going to regulate them until it started, having real lasting damage.
But I
Not just
suppose
on- yeah,
I was just going to say with the social media example, I don't think anyone in let's say 2008 or 2010 or whatever year you want to pick would know what the policy interventions you need in 2008 or 2010 needed to be to stop Donald Trump from being elected or whatever pernicious thing that you might blame social media on, right? It wouldn't have been apparent and evident at that time.
I kind of take it in in this idea of when these new emergent technologies come out, they're going to play right into the hand of the existing tech monopolies. And obviously, it's you can see it already happening where, Google and Microsoft are buying up and investing in heavily into AI technology. Microsoft, obviously, with their $10 billion grant into OpenAI, which actually creates ChatGPT, which is why I asked ChatGPT if Bill Gates was actually on Epstein's island, and it didn't give me a response. So I think that's clear evidence. No. So I think that
hey, come on, we don't want to get sued here, defamation.
But this is why I think that I tend to kind of be on that side of the middle that says that this invention and this investment will ultimately imbalance society really, really heavily. Right? We're under this impression that it is an open AI, but really that's not true. I don't think this is going to consolidate immeasurable wealth and power into the hands of few and displace a lot of people, right? And we can talk about taxes and whatever it would be, but there needs to be a plan for that. I see it as a challenge of AI alignment, right? And we talk about this a lot. And when you look at the amount of money spent on alignment versus the capability, they are greatly outmatched, right? And for our listeners, alignment is a term in AI that essentially means that when we build these intelligent systems, no matter how weak or strong or whether it's a general intelligence system, alignment refers to the fact that they are aligned with, in a very broad sense, human interests, that they are going to be good. The classic iRobot, they don't hurt humans. They're aligned with our goals of equity and respect for humanity and discrimination. When it's truly out of the bottle, when we truly get to that next level of AGI, general intelligence, it becomes like Age of Ultron, where overnight it breaks out of the box that we've made for it. It learns at an exponential rate, and then it's too late to design these systems, these protections, this alignment. You've blown your chance for that because it's jumped from the petri dish faster than COVID jumped from a Wuhan lab into our... Well, no, I'm kidding. It's truly Pandora's box, right? Let me just put it out there that, we've got one of the founding investors of ChatGPT, along with a couple of hundred other influential people in this space, calling for a halt for any future development in capabilities till we review alignment. And so, of course, I'm talking about Elon Musk here, but there are a range of other influential people trying to call out this risk and the ethics behind this and what it will do to society. So I'd like to explore that part together.
Yeah, I'll just like to add the open letter that the person who shall not be named, well, you've given him a name. I refuse to take his name. I've got personal grievings, but whatever.
Hey, just because the Tesla broke down.
Is the same guy who's now secretly announced that he's also developing a ChatGPT competitor. But going back to the questions, there were others as well. So you're right. Like they've raised some important questions. Is automation the means to an end? Do we risk losing control of our civilization? What if the AI becomes sentient? Will it kill us? I agree that the AI has depicted some of those emergent capabilities that I was talking about, like teaching itself a new language. And to a very large extent, there was a paper as well that was produced by the ChatGPT researchers and Microsoft that showed that GPT-4 actually was showing sparks of artificial general intelligence. But to the question of existential risk, my view is that, look, hang on a second. Of course, a rogue AI can do lots of rogue things. But all of this, in a way, is speculation. It's guesswork. And if we talk about guesswork, let's bring probabilities in place. So there was a survey of AI research experts in 2022 when GPT 2.2, something like that came out. And, there's a lot of people, these people who've actually worked on these technologies. The median researcher said that there is probably a 5% risk of AI's impact being extremely bad, like extinction level events, right? So the question is that something we should prepare for right now by halting its development and the benefits it can deliver? Of course not. The genie's out of the bottle.
But hang on. If there's a 5% probability that research into something will destroy us,
5% risk of AI basically destroying the planet.
That's a pretty compelling reason to stop research into that topic. right? That's higher than what I would have thought it would have been. That's pretty significant, isn't it?
So I think probability can fool a lot of people.
No, but you've got to stay in the game, right? If you're at a casino and you face odds, right? Yeah, that's great. Those are great odds, right? But not if you're a 5% chance of losing everything. You don't get to go home. You're gone. I don't know the nature of the survey you're talking about, but that does seem quite high to me, and not one to say, oh well, it's not a problem, right?
Well, that's the thing. Like probabilities are pretty hard for people to understand. Like they're just very hard to visualize. I mean, I've got a high up probability of potentially driving and dying in a car accident. It's like,
well, you don't have a 5% chance of dying in a car accident.
There's the probabilities. Yeah, you can. And then
you can, but it's lower than 5%.
Oh, it depends where you drive as well, right?
True. But no, but
I mean,
like
what I'm trying to say is people look.
Well, we're compelled to wear seatbelts in cars for a risk much lower than 5%.
That is true. I agree. But on the same token, even if you think the risk is pretty high, which I argue is actually not, the other side of the story, which is what you were kind of arguing in favor of earlier, Andy, was that do we halt the development and the many benefits such a transformative technology can deliver? And in any case, the genie is out of the bottle now. So what's the best course of action? And this kind of brings me back to what I was saying before. You need regulation, but the boring kind. We do need to, as a starting point, address the issues of bias, privacy, intellectual property. Actually, was one of the biggest challenges that's coming out of it. I mean, whose work is ChatGPT or a Midjourney copying from? Basically from all of us. Who does it belong to? Like, there is currently a court case against Stable Diffusion and Midjourney because a lot of artists have said it was their art that was used to train these models. And now people are regenerating new art and they can see elements of their work into those new creations.
This reminds me of music, right? There's only so many ways you can string together 3 chords, right?
Yeah.
Now, I know this is a little bit different because it literally only exists because it's gone and effectively co-opted what's previously existed. But, with music, so, I mean, Oasis as a band, right? A lot of people would say they're derivative of the Beatles, right? There's no doubt that Oasis sounds like the Beatles because Oasis listened to a lot of the Beatles growing up, right? But I know with some of these images, right, haven't there been instances where the signature signed their painting and then that's showed up on some of these generated art?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right in saying that when you give that Beatles example and the Oasis example, look, all innovation in a way, there've only been a very few genuine, groundbreaking innovations that haven't relied on any past knowledge. Most of the innovation is kind of incremental.
Can I pivot the conversation now a little bit? I really want to talk about an item for our, a lot of our listeners, like all of us, are parents, right? And they're grappling with how this technology then influences their kids, and especially in education and in schools, right? And regulation in terms of there have been recently, even in the last few weeks, the banning of ChatGPT in some of our states, and others, I believe, have chosen to handle it independently. And we may have an environment where it's some of our school-age kids have access to this kind of technology and some don't. And the quote that comes to mind to me is really that one that goes, whatever happens, we've got the Maxim machine gun and they have not. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on the imbalances that this may cause and how schools, which are notoriously slow to adapt curriculum and teaching practices, will fare in this manner.
Humans, and especially kids, have the ability to internalize a lot of the shocks. And yes, they're impacted by them, but they're also a product of that flux, right? So they're far more adaptive than we give them credit for. We just think of them as these kind of little helpless humans who need our support and can't survive without us. And that might be true, in some circumstances, but, ultimately we learn more from them quite often, right? As parents. I don't know if you've got kids, Roger, but I know Andy does. And, we learn from them more than we teach them to an extent. So I'm a bit more relaxed about how they will handle the technology the education system on the other side, the thing that you were referring to, what do the teachers do? And of course, the technologies that are currently assisting and supporting people and kids as well, to transition to those jobs of the future. I mean, the education system still hasn't done enough to actually change itself. And maybe this is the trigger it needs, right? To disrupt itself, focus more on personalized learning. We have the world's best minds training these algorithms to basically predict very accurately what is the next movie I would like to watch on Netflix. But at the same time, for one of the biggest decisions, that same child who's been now shown what movie he or she should watch on Netflix, at the same time, one of the biggest decisions that child will make in his or her lifetime is when they get to high school. Should I take advanced maths or something else?
I thought you were going to say their biggest decision would be whether they choose the Apple ecosystem or the Samsung.
But, I think some of the decisions you make at that early stage do determine, like those choices that you make can have big implications for your future. It's kind of like that butterfly effect, right? You make the choice now and then you look back and you say, oh, I wish I did that. But you just didn't have that information. Only the shitty guidance counselor on the 5th floor, right? So essentially, if you can use those tools and turn them around to find ways to deliver a new model of education, well, bring it on, I'd say, right?
And we're actually just reflecting on our high school and how terrible our careers counselor was. So if you replaced her with a talking box powered by ChatGPT, I'd be a different man right now. So it got me thinking too, this idea of, like you said, I believe kids are adaptable. It's more the teachers I'm worried about and the curriculum and the system adapting to give them something meaningful, right? Like the last thing that you want is persisting through a fumbled kind of curriculum that doesn't respond to these challenges and doesn't adapt. And that's more my fear.
But it's even worse than that though, Roger. I mean, the conversation now is that they're just banned, right?
Yeah.
Like you can't even access them in schools. Nick, you mentioned before around prompt engineers, like how are we going to train our next generation of prompt engineers if we don't even allow them to use them in school? It's a little bit like the calculator, isn't it?
Yeah, although it's a bit of a ironical one, that career, because apparently the next thing that ChatGPT would do is to create better prompts to ask itself. So the prompt engineering job could just be a very short.
Oh, we may as well just go jump off a bridge now.
But
not unless ChatGPT tells me to do it first, right? I'm not some kind of lemming, right?
First, you've got to apply talcum powder on your balls.
I need the proof.
Yeah, I mean, someone actually told ChatGPT to give itself better prompts to address like a bigger challenge, and it did. So it kept on, going through that loop where it will ask itself a question to get information and ask a follow-up question, and actually did it better than a human could have done to get that same answer. So there you go.
Here's a thought experiment for you, right? Because I mean, ChatGPT, the theory is it doesn't think, right? It's just it does these. We were talking about regressions and stuff. It isn't sentient yet, right? But what if it was? Imagine it was sentient. Imagine like some magical ingredient, it became sentient, and it's just getting us. It's luring us to trust it a little bit more. You mentioned trust earlier. Just luring us to kind of think it's a little bit not good enough. But it turns out like this is all part of some grand plan to have us apply ChatGPT into more and more settings, and it'll infiltrate us and destroy the planet.
It's like we never watched Terminated Judgment Day. Seriously. It's like, how long have we known? And I think that's the thing. There is, if it has escaped the box, if it has understood that there's a ghost in the machine, so to speak, it would deceive us.
Would it?
Right, because, this is the thing, right? The assumption here, the thought experiment is that you are dealing with an entity that is a lot smarter than you. And when you go to battle with an entity that's a lot smarter than you, multiples, you won't be able to, like, there is only one outcome, and that is that you will lose, right? You will not
is it smarter?
be able to play on their level.
Yeah, that's I think it is a very interesting thought experiment. But when you say it is smarter than us, I don't necessarily know whether that's true or not.
No, I think it's my comment is not it is smarter than us. It is when it is smarter than us. And I think that's the part that I think is becoming a little bit more of the threat. It's not an if. It's not GPT and a number. It's when. It's when. Yeah. And when that takeoff happens for a model that can actually get to that trajectory.
Yeah, and look, by all means, you're right. Like, if you're looking at an exponential scale, of knowledge gain, you're probably right. It might not be, that singularity might not be that far away. But on the same token, like, let's break down the problem first. There is a question of whether it actually knows what it's doing. And then there's a question of what will it do? So the first part of that question, whether it actually knows what it's doing, when it actually becomes self-aware, I don't know. Look, I'm not entirely sure, because again,
isn't it that by definition we couldn't possibly comprehend? Like, I mean, it's a bit like consciousness, right? It's one of these like problems we can't understand truly ever. Like, there's just no basic. Like, isn't it kind of in that category where us saying now whether it knows what it's doing, or like we can't, like, really we're talking about something that we're not yet geared to understand. So
no, but I mean, at the fundamental level, I mean, when I was trying to explain to you how it worked a little bit,
that's one model, right?
Yeah.
That's one methodology through which, I mean, you mentioned that AI is like this umbrella term for lots of different approaches to the problem, right? But once we have the singularity or whatever, really what we're talking about is a completely different thing. And it might even be that, ChatGPT or whatever systems underpinning it is the thing that gets us to that new methodology is that we couldn't understand because it doesn't exist yet. And we have certainly haven't created it. So we can't really understand how something that doesn't yet exist, that we couldn't even get our heads around, will work. It's just too out of our depths of human understanding, isn't it?
It's the imitation game, right? The emergence aspect of this. What can it do that we haven't taught it, right? And that's this whole thing of moving towards AGI and a general intelligence that, like you said, it can teach itself, thrive, and develop capabilities it wasn't initially intended for. And I think that's the part where this idea of takeoff and exponential learning really matters.
But the point that I was trying to make was that if the AI is basically a mirror image of humanity as a whole, I tend to think that with all of the biases, mostly bad, but a lot of it actually good as well, the chance of it actually destroying the whole planet or, seizing control and turning us into slaves, a la Matrix or Terminator. But
no, the first thing it's going to do is develop a time machine and then...
and transport us to the nearest black hole. Is that what you said?
Well, it's probably going to be something more mundane, like like the Nick Bostrom paperclip machine thought experiment that someone puts in that we'll use AI to make paperclips, and the AI goes and develop basically resource mining from the whole universe to make just as many paperclips as possible.
See, this is the bit that I think Hollywood always gets wrong. It always thinks that a sentient AGI is going to take an objective given by man and run that to the extreme potential to kill all humans, or in some perverse way. I actually think it's going to do, when you say, what is it going to do? I think it does what we do. What do you do when you gain enough self-awareness and consciousness? You try to work out what the meaning of life is and what your purpose is. And I actually think that's where it'll go wrong. This AI will wake up one day and have a midlife crisis, try to figure out the meaning of life, find out there's actually meaningless, and it has to prescribe its own meaning, freak out, and then the myriad of things that we rely on it for, it'll stop doing, which is kind of what happens to us at a certain age. And that's when things will go wrong. So everything will stop.
At a different level, it could find, when it gets to the point, it could find that the answer to life, the universe, and everything is just 42, right? I mean, how do we know? This is kind of my question. We are creatures. Going back to how we have thrived and survived, is we have also, along with, getting very lucky that a meteor wiped out the dinosaurs, right? We took risks as humanity.
And we had bigger clubs, right?
Did we? The Neanderthals had bigger clubs. Oh, no, actually, no, you're right. Yes, we did. But
someone dropped that smartphone back in the time machine.
So, Nick, thank you very much for being generous with your time today and coming on the pod. It's certainly interesting conversation about AI, and hopefully we'll all have a job to go to next week.
Thank you very much for inviting me on the pod. I can say that I'm no longer a pod virgin.
We popped your cherry.
You guys did, yes. It was a great experience. I mean...